Lori Lightfoot joins us. She wants to be mayor of the city of Chicago. A variety of other people also want to be mayor, but we're going to spend the next few minutes talking about you and a little bit about your background. First of all, for those that don't know you, give us a little, 45-second bio on where you're from and why you're here.
Well, I've lived in Chicago for the last 32 years, but I grew up in a small steel town about 60 miles south of Cleveland. I lived there until I went away to college at the University of Michigan, spent 2 years in Washington, D.C. working on Capitol Hill, and then I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship to the University of Chicago Law School, which is what brought me here to Chicago.
Who'd you work with on the Hill?
I work with the local congressman from my district, a guy named Ralph Regula, who is a dairy farmer and part of the Watergate class. And then for a very short time, I worked for Barbara Mikulski when she was running for Senate.
Mm-hmm. And when you came to Chicago, you went to the U of C and you ended up at a pretty good law firm.
I did. I was very fortunate. I worked my first summer after law school at Mayor Brown, which was Mayor Brown and Platt in those days. And then I was able, after a clerkship on the Michigan Supreme Court, to come back to Mayor Brown after that clerkship.
Of all the disciplines of law, which one did you choose and why?
Well, I'm an advocate by nature, so I became a litigator. We called ourselves commercial litigators, but I really was involved in any kind of litigation that you can imagine. I eventually went to the U.S. Attorney's Office as a federal prosecutor, and so I also did white-collar criminal defense work as well as representing a number of indigent defendants on pro bono cases.
Because of your involvement with the Police Review Board, which is one of your main areas of expertise, there are some people who are looking to vote, and they might say that you might be too soft on crime. You might be too anti-police. Your reaction?
Well, anybody that knows me knows that that's not so. I think it's critically important that we have to do everything we can to keep our community safe. Public safety really has become this kind of overarching issue that really affects everything else. People are not going to stay in the city if they don't feel safe. Businesses are not going to invest in neighborhoods if they don't feel like they're actually going to have their employees that are safe. So public safety and getting that right is critically important. And it's important for people to know, in the last 7 years since Rahm Emanuel was sworn in, 23,000 people have been shot. Those are individuals, families, neighborhoods whose lives have been irreparably harmed and shattered. And part of the reason, frankly, is because we had a mayor who really knew very little about local policing when he took the oath of office back in 2011. We can't afford to make that mistake again. So I'm a person who comes at the issue of public safety from a lot of different perspectives. I'm a former federal prosecutor. I've been a defense attorney. I know a lot about police reform and accountability. So I think all of those experiences feed into my thoughts and focus on what the things that we need to do to keep our citizens safe and have our communities thrive.
When challenging, obviously, the mayor, you're also challenging Gary McCarthy. Is there any separation between those two?
Well, I mean, Gary was brought to Chicago after his tenure in Newark, and following his departure from Newark, Newark's police department went into a consent decree, and I've reviewed the documents and public testimony about that. There were some terrible things that happened under Gary's watch. He came here, frankly, with Rahm Emanuel knowing about his track record in Newark. He brought aggressive stop and frisk to the south and west sides. We were threatened with, the city was threatened with litigation by the ACLU, which is the only thing that stopped that. But what I also heard from officers is they didn't feel like they understood their mission. They were stopping literally every person that moved, and they didn't really see the strategic plan because it wasn't explained to them. So yeah, I think that Gary and Rahm are really very much intertwined.
Now, in the forums that I've attended, virtually everyone has been opposed to with the exception of Gary McCarthy, has been opposed to the idea of having this master list of potential criminals that's based on all kinds of, experts, alleged experts, coming up with a long list. And they've all said they're going to get rid of it, including, I think you said you'd get rid of it as well. Why is that a bad idea? And should it be totally thrown out, or is there a better way to just sort of rework it?
Well, look, there's a value, of course, in having intelligence. I think about it in the context of counterintelligence. If we had done a better job in the lead up to 9/11, then we may be in a different place than we are right now. The problem is that the police department has mismanaged both the content of the database, and it's really multiple databases, and the PR strategy around the fact that they have this database and how they're using it. First, they came out with what they call the strategic subjects list. Well, that's actually an algorithm that was created by a professor at IIT Kent. The police department doesn't own it. They don't control the inputs into the algorithm. And so saying, oh, we have 1,400 people that we know are bad actors, when crime is raging out of control, the common response is, well, if you know who these folks are, why aren't you doing something about it? So I think they badly bungled the communication strategy around the strategic subject list. Now we have these databases, and for simplicity's sake, I'll call it a database. And the problem is no one knows how you get on it. I think there's something like 11% of African American population in the city that are on it. We have people on it that are 80 years old that may not have committed a crime or been involved in illegal conduct for decades. So it's lost its legitimacy. So what I think we have to do is really kind of start from square one, come up with a list of specific, transparent protocols. People ought to know if they're on it or not. There ought to be a mechanism for people to petition to get off of it if they're wrongfully there. I'll tell you one of the worst and scariest things about the database. If you're a kid who acts out in CPS and you're a teacher who calls for discipline of some sort for this kid, that's a way in which you can get on the database. That makes no sense whatsoever. And the database.
So it's a permanent record.
It's the most permanent of permanent records. I don't think it aids the police department in the way that it should be. And as I said, I think it's just been delegitimized, and we have to start over. You
have obviously your strong suit is criminal justice and police relations, but there's other issues facing this city, financial issues, pension issues, issues of education. Right. Where does your expertise come from in those areas?
Well, in the city of Chicago, we are fortunate that we have a huge bandwidth of experts on virtually every issue that's facing the city. So what I've been doing from day one, and frankly it's been part of my work over the last 4 or 5 years, is really listening to the experts, identifying people that I think have not just the critique, but offer innovative solutions that can really move us forward in a meaningful way. We've got the University of Chicago, UIC, that focuses on urban issues, and Northwestern. And then we've got a host of not-for-profits that are really a great source of information.
Haven't other mayors and administrations used that valuable academic?
I do not think they have in the way that they should, frankly. These are incredibly valuable resources, and I know in particular over the last 7 years, a lot of these folks have put out good studies, good analysis, and they're on the outside looking in. I don't think that city government has taken full advantage of these incredible resources in the way that I will.
Would your administration be made up of people who've worked for several other administrations?
It really depends on who we're talking about, and I'm not prepared to name names today. What I think that we have an obligation and an opportunity to do is draw upon the incredible expertise that we've got literally at every level in our city, from the grassroots to the academy to business to philanthropy. We have an amazing bounty of expertise, and I would look to draw upon that in the areas that I think that we need it.
If Toni Preckwinkle loses for mayor, she's still going to be the county board president.
That's right.
If Susana Mendoza loses for mayor, she's still going to be the state comptroller. Would you be able to work with either of them in their capacities if you beat them?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I think it's important that the mayor of Chicago has relationships with people not only in Cook County, in Springfield, but all over the region. There are big regional issues where the city, frankly, needs to step up and lead. Obviously, the environment is one of them. But making sure that you forge those kind of relationships is critically important. And you got to think about that, in particular when you're talking about transforming city government and making it more accountable to the people of the city. I wouldn't leave any resource or partnership on the cutting room floor if I thought that it was going to advance the interests of Chicago.
You have been promoted as the first openly gay candidate for mayor of the city of Chicago. There's a lot of people in the city that don't support that lifestyle, as you know. Many of them are in the African American community, the religious leaders on the south and west sides of Chicago. What would you say to them about who you are, and explain to them that even though they may oppose your personal lifestyle, you could be their leader?
Well, I have to tell you, I haven't found that level of hostility or reticence about who I am, because I think I'm a person who presents as earnest. I talk a lot about, frankly, my family and my parents in particular, both of whom were born in the segregated South and really suffered mightily under the yoke of Jim Crow. My parents were very religious, God-fearing people. They raised me and my siblings in the church. And so I understand the religiosity and spirituality of the Black community, of which I'm a part. So when I go to churches and I talk about those issues. I also think, frankly, that you look across the congregations of church-going people on the South Side, and there are a lot of people who come to their spirituality from a lot of different diversity. There's a significant gay, Black, and brown population in the city. Now, they don't get a lot of attention like what happens, frankly, in predominantly white Boys Town or Andersonville, but that population exists. I know them. I've been a part of that community for a long time. But I think, frankly, fundamentally, what people want to know is, can you lead? Do you have the strength of character to be able to do it? Do you have the experience to have the bandwidth to be able to take on the task of being the leader of the third largest city in the country? And what are your ideas and vision for the future? I think those are the issues that are foremost in people's minds as they evaluate candidates. I'm never going to shrink from who I am. It's critically important that I and, frankly, other people, regardless of what their background is, live their authentic self and life. And I think people respect me for that.
One of the issues that this city faces is whether or not legalized recreational marijuana will come to this city. Do you support that idea?
I do. I mean, if you look at poll after poll, it's something that voters want to see happen. What I've said about it is we need to be smart. We need to learn the lessons from other states that are ahead of us in legalizing cannabis. The experiences, for example, of Colorado are very different than that of Oregon. I think we need to also make sure that we provide an opportunity for communities of color that have been ravaged by the war on drugs to be able to benefit from legalization and ownership of businesses that are going to be involved in this. And we have experience with that in this state through the gaming industry. When casino gambling was first legalized here, there were a lot of stopgaps that were put in place to allow for minority and women-owned ownership of gaming, and we need to draw upon that experience. And obviously, we need to make sure we do whatever possible to keep marijuana out of the hands of our children.
But do you acknowledge that cannabis can be injurious
Look,
to populations? I mean, we have a unique situation where on the national level we're talking about stopping drugs and fentanyl and everything at the border, and at least the federal government is talking about it more than they have in recent years. And then you have cities all over the country and states all over the country going the other way, looking at marijuana. Is that a mixed signal that's being sent to voters, and is it being presented as a fiscal panacea that may not be real?
Well, it's clearly not going to be a fiscal panacea. Obviously, if the state taxes the sale of marijuana, there will be some financial benefit, to be sure. How large, I don't think we know true numbers. Look, your point about is it a harmful drug? I think we need to make sure that we do everything possible to keep it out of the hands of teenagers in particular, and obviously younger people, because their brain physiology is still developing. Frankly, because of a lot of taboos at the federal level, there haven't been the kind of rigorous studies of marijuana that I hope will happen now, that this is seriously under consideration in a lot of states. But that's why I draw the line and say, yes, I support legalization, but I want to make sure that we have the proper protections in place to keep marijuana out of the hands of our kids.
Voters who are listening to this broadcast and watching you tonight, they're going to make a decision on you. But there's other names, other choices that they can have. One of the names is a brand name in Chicago. It's the Daley name. It's the
Yes.
Daley legacy. What does the Daley legacy mean to you as someone who's lived in the city for 32 years?
Well, somebody who lived in the city and worked for a time in city government when Mayor Richard M. Daley was mayor. Look, I think it's mixed, to be honest. Clearly, I think that it never makes sense to have somebody in office as long as Rich Daley was in office. I think what we saw towards the end of his tenure were not enough people who could go to him and say, this is a bad idea, you need to do this. There were people who, frankly, he didn't regard as his peers, and I think that that was a problem. I also think that when you have that level of incumbency built up over almost 20 years, it crushes any kind of challenge and innovation, and I think that that's a problem. Look, a lot has come out in the last 7 years about Rich Daley's tenure that wasn't immediately known at the time. You know, one of the most notorious things, obviously, is the incredibly bad parking meters deal. So I think the Daley name is a mixed bag. I think that Bill Daley's got to stand on his own 2 feet. We still don't, frankly, know a whole lot about him. He doesn't attend very many community forums, so he's not presenting himself to the voters that way. Having a bunch of airbrush TV commercials really isn't giving people an idea of who he is, separate and apart from his brother and his father.
What's been the toughest moment in your life, and how did you respond to it?
Well, I've had a lot of tough moments in my life, so it's hard, frankly, to pick one. I guess what I would say is one of the hardest moments in my life is when I was a sophomore in college. I came home for winter break, and there was just this darkness in my home. My mother normally would have the house totally decorated for Christmas, and the decorations weren't up. And she was kind of in a state of depression. And it turned out that a day or two before Christmas, we got a call that one of my brothers had been locked up because he tried to rob a bank. And we came to learn that he was very strung out on drugs. He was living in another state at the time. And I was young. I mean, I don't even think I was 20 yet. And my parents were absolutely distraught, and they were falling apart. And I had to really step up in that moment and help them navigate that very difficult circumstance. They were looking at, frankly, putting their house, getting another mortgage to help pay for bail for my brother, although we were hearing from relatives in the state that he said if he got out, he was going to flee. So having to navigate that challenge at a fairly young age with my parents, who frankly were, as you would imagine, emotionally distraught, was difficult. But I think, frankly, ultimately, it brought me closer to my parents, and I started really from that moment on stepping up and being kind of the go-to person to take care of my parents from that moment on.
Lori Lightfoot has been our guest. She wants to be mayor of Chicago.